Testing. Aloha mai kako. Look at this room. Oh my goodness. My name is Brianna Govea. I'm the curator of collections and programs here at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. Thank you so much for showing up on your Saturday early afternoon to be here with us. I want to mahalo our acting Chief Justice, Sabrina McKenna, the Hawaii State Judiciary and Legislature for providing space for us to gather here in our beautiful Supreme Court courtroom. Just some quick housekeeping. Bathrooms are located right under the staircases on the ground floor or right in front of the elevators here on the top floor. Our program is being recorded. We have some people joining us via Zoom also, and Dr. Kelli Nakamura's presentation will be posted on the History Center's YouTube channel on Monday, so please feel free to spread her presentation far and wide. We're gathered here today to honor and celebrate the 10th anniversary of Honouliuli's federal designation as a National Historic Site, Hawaii's largest and longest operating World War II internment site, as well as to hold space for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Dr. Kelli Nakamura has a fascinating presentation prepared for us, but before we shift focus, I just want to say some quick words to give some context to this new exhibit that we have, which has really taken a village to put on. At the History Center, we ground everything from our exhibits to our tours and our civic education initiatives from a Hawaiian worldview. And you'll notice when you get downstairs, the exhibit begins with artwork featuring Hawaiian history, culture, and leaders, specifically King Kamehameha I. As you move through the galleries, you'll be introduced to World War II through the eyes, minds, and hands of the featured Issei and Nisei men. And then as you move throughout the other galleries, there will be elements about Honouliuli and how Hawaii's courts and legal community navigated the military's control under martial law. Relics of War, Justice, Culture, and Community in Times of Conflict is an exhibition of the human spirit, hope, and resilience in dark and confusing times, which appear to be among us again. Between the State Foundation's collection of modern artwork and the Japanese Family Collections on loan, we see World War II through the eyes of men on the inside and artists on the outside, trying to find purpose and meaning out of a grave injustice that occurred. Being here today, we honor the lives and legacies of all of those impacted by World War II, and I hope everyone learned something new today or is inspired by something you see in the exhibit to just become more civically engaged and keep sharing these stories. Relics of War would not have been possible without the partnerships and involvement of the National Park Service, Honouliuli, the Hawaii State Bar Association Civic Education Committee, the Hawaii State Foundation on Culture and the Arts, and the Japanese American National Museum in California. JANM digitally loaned us a selection of artwork from internee George Hoshida, who's featured in the exhibit downstairs, and his artwork can be found on the Bloomberg Connects Digital Exhibition Guide, which if you read my email, I asked you to download, please, beforehand so you can get the full experience of the exhibit. I'd also like to shout out my team here at the Judiciary History Center, our Executive Director, Matt, for trusting and supporting new ideas I bring to him about changing things up in our museum. Tai Samasama and Mana'o, our Education Director and Hawaiian Language Education Specialist, for providing copy editing and installation support. And I'm especially grateful to my two curatorial assistants, Olivia and Riva, who checked you all in downstairs. They're from the University of Hawaii at Manoa's Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program, and since August, they've volunteered over 300 hours of their time helping to plan the exhibit, from research and writing to communicating with our descendants and digitizing artifacts for the virtual guide. Here at the Judiciary History Center, we wear many hats, and so it really would not be possible with the assistance of our volunteers and everyone involved over the last 4 months. So I'm so grateful to all of you. And speaking about descendants, the exhibition features 9 Issei and Nisei men who were incarcerated or interned after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Many were separated from their families for nearly 4 years and were unsure of their futures. If you don't mind, I'd like everyone who are descendants of the men featured to please stand so we can acknowledge you if you're comfortable doing so. And Gail, if you want to, yes, thank you. Mahalo nui to the Chang, Fujimoto, Hirano, Hoshida, Kato, Nakagawa, Matsumoto, Tokairan, and Watanabe families for entrusting the History Center with your family collections and sharing your father's and grandfather's stories. I'm very, very grateful. I owe an abundance of gratitude to Dr. Gail Okawa in the green over here, whose grandfather is featured in the exhibit. She connected me to many of the families that have loaned objects and records. Dr. Okawa is the coordinator of the High Connections Santa Fe Internment Camp Descendants Group, Professor Emerita of English at Youngstown State University of Ohio, and a former visiting scholar at UH's Center for Biographical Research, Her profound book, Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, which will be for sale downstairs along with Kelly's, provided the bulk of the historical research for the exhibit. She helped copy edit many of the write-ups that you'll see. And her writing and work in community continues to impact people every year, bringing them together and keeping the memories and harsh lessons of civilian internment during World War II alive. So thank you so much, Gail. Next, huge thanks to Ruth O in the back corner over here, co-chair of the Hawaiʻi State Bar Association Civic Education Committee. Since 2013, the Judiciary History Center and HSBA Civic Education Committee have partnered every year on January 30th for Civil Liberties and the Constitution Day, also known as Fred Korematsu Day, to deliver engaging programming here in the Supreme Court. And Ruth very generously offered to sponsor this exhibition and our event today. So thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you for providing food for all of us to eat when we get downstairs later. Lastly, I'm almost done. Thank you to Christine Ogura, Superintendent of Honouliuli, who has worked extremely hard over the last year, planning monthly events to share Honouliuli's history and the National Park Service's plans to develop it into a public memorial despite the government shutdown and many challenges that were thrown her way. Born and raised here on Oahu in Mo'iliili, Christine worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 14 years before joining the National Park Service last year. She also worked as a legislative assistant for the late Congresswoman Patsy Mink and has supported international conservation efforts in more than 10 countries. She was the planner for the Hawaii Wildlife Action Plan and managed the Hawaii Division of Forestry and Wildlife's Watershed Partnerships Program. Thank you, Christine, for reaching out and giving me the opportunity to be part of sharing Honouliuli's story. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine to introduce our esteemed guest speaker. Thank you.
Well, aloha, everybody. Wow. I will reiterate Brianna's thanks for joining us on your weekend, no less, taking a break from holiday shopping, maybe. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today to hear from Kelly and to also be able to open up and look at this amazing exhibit that Brianna has put together with her team. I, too, just want to do some quick personal thank yous, but also provide a little bit of a park update for folks who might be interested before I hand it off to our esteemed speaker here, Professor Kelli Nakamura. My personal thanks for the descendants at Honouliuli. I've been working with Sandy Chang, who unfortunately can't be here today, but her family is well represented. I see them here, to have some of her grandfather's artifacts here as part of the exhibit. So definitely want to do a personal shout out to Sandy Chang and her family for that support for this important exhibit. Definitely to Kelly, who this is the second time we're partnering on our 10th anniversary. Earlier, she also did a book talk at the shopping Haimuki. She's been great to work with as well. But as Brianna said, it does take a village. And I want to just recognize Brianna. I mean, I started in this position a little over a year ago and came to introduce myself because I know the permanent exhibit has talk about Honouliuli. And from the beginning, Brianna has been an amazing partner to see how we can partner together on the 10th and then how she's put this together. I mean, definitely working with Gail and others, but she was the person leading all of us together, moving forward for this exciting event today. But just throughout the year, she's been an amazing partner. So I also want to recognize Brianna and her team for their support and definitely want to recognize her as well. Just a couple of quick updates about the park that you may all be interested in learning about. So as Brianna had mentioned, this year does mark 10 years since President Obama established us as a national park. We are going to be closing up and wrapping up this celebratory year actually next month at the Downtown Arts Center. It's going to be our finale event from January. We're going to kick it off, but it's going to be a community art exhibit. We welcome members of the community to learn about the park and interpret that history. And we just looked at the submissions which were due this past Monday, and we've got some incredible artwork and pieces that were submitted. So I encourage all of you to come and take a look at that. It'll be open for about 2 weeks at the Downtown Arts Center. So that's kind of going to be our finale wrap-up event. But next year also marks a pretty significant event for the park. It's another big commemorative year in that it will be 80 years since the camp was closed. So we are planning 2 or 3 significant events for the park next year to commemorate that closing of the camp for 80 years ago. And so if you go to our website, I think on your seat you all have our 2025 postcards. It's our websites there. We have social media if you follow us. We'll be announcing all those opportunities for the 80th events that we're planning right now with partners as well. 2 other things that may be of interest to folks before I hand it off to Kelly is that part of next year also is that we're going to be going out for public input about what visitation to the park may look like, what kind of public use facilities may be there. So we'll be going out to the community with some preliminary concepts that have been built on decades and years of already pre-planning and talks with partners and community members as well. So look out for that. And the last update for next year is we are working toward opening the park up for public tours. The reason why it's not currently open to public tours is because the Park Service does not own any lands that connect us to a public roadway. So unlike the other national park on island, which is Pearl Harbor, people just can't drive up to it. We're kind of surrounded by other landowners, one of which is University of Hawaii West Oahu, has been a great partner. So I am working with them to open up the park and provide public access, to provide limited public tours to the park starting next year. Right now, we're hoping for early summer. The shutdown kind of pushed us back a little bit for some of the things like, trying to get porta potties in place. So there are some basic nuts and bolts about that to be able to do that. So we're working with UH West Oahu to do so, and they've been great partners. So that's kind of another exciting update for next year that I just wanted to share with folks. So with that, I am definitely going to be handing this over to Kelly to be able to start us off and to open up the exhibit, but more importantly, hear about the great work that she's been doing. So Professor Kelli Nakamura is a professor at Kapilani Community College. Her research interests focus on Japanese and Japanese American history. She has published articles in the Journal of World History, AmerAsia, The Historian, the Pacific Historical Review, and the Hawaiiana Journal of History, where she currently serves as a co-editor. She also teaches at the Ethnic Studies and History Department at UH Manoa as well. So with that, please welcome Kelly, and we are looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. How's the volume? Volume good? Okay. First off, thank you very much for being here. Unfortunately, I usually do not stand behind a pedestal or, in fact, behind a desk because usually my students complain that they cannot see me. So I'm very grateful that it's a low desk, and thank you all again for taking time out of your Saturday to visit us here. And again, please take advantage of not just, of course, touring the brand new kind of exhibit downstairs, but also, of course, there will be refreshments afterwards. So thank you. My topic today really kind of covers a very kind of unique angle in talking about the incarceration experience here in Hawaii. A lot of us, of course, focus on the Oahu experience, which of course absolutely is critical and important to understanding. But I also want to kind of broaden our lens to look at incarceration as having not just roots within the plantation experience, of course, here in Hawaii, but also throughout the other neighbor islands that many of us, in fact, are descended from. So to give kind of background for my family, my father's family is from Kauai. My grandfather was born and raised on a plantation in Kapaa, Kauai. So that kind of neighbor island experience, in fact, is very important to include as part of the overall incarceration narrative. But of course, to begin our story, we really kind of have to broaden our view to look at the global events that would in fact transform not just, of course, our island, but also, of course, globally, the things that will occur and the people and the individuals that will be involved in kind of a global scale that in fact can be encapsulated in the Hawaii incarceration experience. So to look at, of course, Hawaii's experience, we really have to trace it back to the beginnings of the plantations in the mid to late 19th century, where we're going to see, of course, very entrepreneurial individuals from America, Great Britain, among other nations, coming and trying to establish cash crop agriculture throughout the various islands that we call home. Okay. Now, what we also see, of course, during this time, as we see the development of cash crop agriculture, is the emergence of large kind of governments with kind of totalitarian, authoritative kinds of inclinations. And we're going to see, of course, the emergence of the three great Axis powers, which, of course, are going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan at this time, who during the 1930s will align themselves in a series of alliances and essentially agreements and diplomatic negotiations to create the so-called Axis powers. Okay. Now, for us in here in the Hawaii and the Pacific, we really want to kind of focus on the actions or the events that will occur, particularly as relates to Japan. And beginning in the 1920s and the 1930s, Japan will essentially adopt racial Western ideas of racial superiority, believing themselves to be the superior Asian race or people of color. And as such, they're going to articulate their goals in what will be known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So they believed, again, being the superior people of color, that they would take over, expand, conquer other nations for their other benefits, not, of course, just for Japan's, but for these other so-called inferior nations. So at this time, of course, Japan will head east, also not just to China, invade parts of Manchuria, but also head down south to parts of Southeast Asia. We will see them, of course, in places like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Thailand, among other areas. And we're going to see them slowly engage in an island hopping campaign to begin essentially conquering much of the Pacific basin. Now, Japan at this time, of course, if you know anything about Japan, is an incredibly mountainous, very resource poor nation. And as such, Japan will expand globally using naval power. And of course, as they're expanding, we are going to see them incorporating other territories, conquering other countries, and taking over their resources. Now, as part of this naval expansion, we will also see Japan coming into increased contact and later conflict with the other great naval power in the Pacific at this time, which will be the Americans. Now, America also is a very highly expansionist and militaristic, besides, of course, materialistic. They are also very militaristic and will also, of course, be expanding throughout the Pacific Basin. And as such, during the 1930s and the 1940s, Japan and America will be coming into increasing contact and conflict with one another. Now, we're going to be looking at two kind of different perspectives of the global Pacific War. As Japan will be expanding, America, seeing it to be a threat to their political and economic well-being, during the 1940s and 1930s, in fact, earlier, will be establishing an oil embargo. The Japanese themselves will perceive that as, of course, an economic and military threat. So we have competing economic as well as military goals brewing in the Pacific during the 1940s. Now, at that time, we're going to see, of course, Japan perceiving America's oil embargo of its essentially naval ships as a direct military threat. And Japan will then turn its attention to, of course, the premier or primary American military installation in the Pacific, which is, of course, Pearl Harbor. Now, December 7th, 1941, which is literally a few days from now, at that time was in fact a Sunday, a beautiful Sunday morning here on Oahu. We do actually have reports as early as 6 a.m. that there were these unknown flyers coming in, flying to essentially the island chain. Now, we do know, of course, at that time, the Americans were in fact expecting a squadron of flyers from California. They thought, in fact, these unknown objects or flyers coming in were, in fact, these pilots arriving early from the west coast of the United States, not recognizing that these were, in fact, Japanese pilots coming to attack Pearl Harbor. Okay. Now, what is kind of interesting, I personally, of course, find this very fascinating about how America was prepared but not prepared for the December 7th attack. And we can actually see this, and I tell this to my students at Kapi'olani Community College. We see clear evidence all around us of America's preparedness and expectation that the Japanese, in fact, would attack from the south. And I say this, I said, you know, we look out at Kapi'olani Community College. The first thing that we see, of course, is Diamond Head, where still today you can see these little pillboxes and fortifications. You see all the hikers and the homeless there. And we, of course, are surrounded by Fort Ruger, Fort DeRussy. And, of course, if you go down to Waikiki, you will visit, and I will say this very respectfully, one of the worst converted museums that you will ever experience. If you go down to the Army Museum, and I say that respectfully, I've visited there. The current Army Museum down at Fort DeRussy was not designed to be a museum. It was actually military fortifications. They actually had guns pointed to the south with the expectations that the Japanese would attack from the south. So imagine here the Americans preparing for the oncoming perception of the Japanese attack coming from the south. And of course, these darn Japanese arrive from the north, so from the opposite direction. So imagine the guns are pointing one way and the Japanese are coming from the opposite. So here we have, of course, the Japanese arriving from the north, from the windward side, and essentially they will be very strategic in how they will attack Oahu and these various military bases. And what I really also love about this time of history is that we actually have photographs from the Japanese pilots and their view of Hawaii before the attack. So imagine here the Japanese pilots, you actually hear local accounts at this time of local residents, you know, waving to the Japanese pilots, flying over the Ko'olau mountain range because, of course, they were such low-flying planes as they were essentially crossing over the windward side to attack Pearl Harbor. And imagine you are a Japanese kamikaze pilot and you are viewing Ford Island, which is absolutely a perfect target, easily recognizable, and of course, with the military installations clearly visible and in close proximity to one another. Okay? So what you will also see is that the Japanese strategically targeted certain ships, and they also knew that many of these ships were, of course, fully armed, completely fueled, and they would strategically target pretty much every other ship because they knew that upon bombing one ship, likely, of course, the gasoline, the subsequent explosion would then spread to the other ship or surrounding areas. So imagine, of course, you are viewing this, and again, these are images from these Japanese pilots, literally just strafing one battleship after another. So it kind of explains the effectiveness of the Pearl Harbor attack with a very limited military force. Okay. Now, again, not only would Pearl Harbor be attacked, but other naval, Air Force, Marine installations across Oahu. So we will also see them, of course, hitting not just Wheeler Field, but also, of course, Kaneohe Naval Air Station. And imagine, of course, these bases are all kind of individually going to be attacked. And of course, we do not have H3 at this time, so there's no easy conduit between these military bases. I mean, we're literally, people are driving around the island, if at all, okay, to try to address these various attacks that are going on almost simultaneously. Okay. Now imagine, of course, you are waking up, and of course this was the newspaper that would appear the following day, and I always joke to my students that if you did not know that you had been attacked, you clearly were sleeping, you clearly did not know what was going on. The fact that you had to publicize this really kind of shows, though, the shock and awe of this actual event. Hawaii residents, Americans were completely caught unprepared by this event. But I really kind of wanted to focus on the disparities in casualty numbers. So if you look at essentially the number of essentially Japanese casualties in comparison to American casualties, it's quite staggering. You will see how effective the Japanese were. And many of these, of course, casualties came not just from the air attack, but we also hear about stories of midget submarines being breached, essentially landing, being attacked, not just in Pearl Harbor, but the surrounding beaches around Oahu and other areas. But really, we do see kind of the effectiveness of this attack by the very sheer statistics of this all. Now, for this part of the presentation, I like to play this game with my students of where is this? Meaning that, of course, these are a lot of photographs of areas here in Hawaii that maybe some people can recognize. What I also, of course, like to explain to my students that not only do these attacks occur over military bases, but responding American pilots also got into dogfights or aerial fights or conflicts with essentially Japanese kamikaze pilots, not just over military bases, but over residential areas. And what we see here, we jokingly like to call ground zero for many of these aerial attacks, which would be in this corner here. Does anyone recognize where this is? Yes, King and McCully Street. So on the corner, as you're crossing the bridge, Jack in the Box is on the corner, Central Pacific Bank. Now it's the bike shop, but it was formerly Cafe Marvro. And now there's a barber shop, but they formerly McCully Chop Suey. Does anyone remember those restaurants, right? That was essentially ground zero for many of these unexploded ordinances to fall from the sky and essentially destroy McCully and Moʻiliʻili. And which is kind of ironic also, and I also say this from my mother's side. My mother's side, they were from Ewa Plantation, but they actually moved to McCully and Moʻiliʻili, which at that time, and I say this respectfully, was a Japanese ghetto. It was a Japanese neighborhood. Old Japanese neighborhood, you know, wooden houses, plantation houses. Everyone knew of each other. There was a community bathhouse. My grandparents used to tell me stories about, you know, they all knew each other and they all knew the neighbors. And as such, it was really kind of striking, you know, to see bombs literally fall on their neighborhood. Okay. Now, a few hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, we are going to see martial law declared. And of course, the military will take over as their primary seat of government, this place, which is Iolani Palace, right across from us here, which of course is this incredible injustice to the Hawaiian people. The former residents of their kings and their queens would essentially be ransacked and essentially just stripped of its belongings and taken over as a seat of military government. So what I also like to share with my students is that we historians not just like to look at books and old archives, but we also like to check out auction houses to see still today there are memorial, you know, memorabilia, objects, things that literally were stolen from Hawaii, including, of course, from Iolani Palace that have yet to be repatriated back. Because, of course, these objects were just stolen, stripped, the palace was stripped and turned into essentially military headquarters. So these are one of these unusual habits that still today we like to do. We like to look at auction houses for things that appear. What does kind of turn up? Still today, of course, there are missing objects at Iolani Palace. Okay. Now, of course, being here at the Judiciary Center, you can read about and learn more about the stripping of civil rights with the declaration of martial law. We have essentially the removal of civil authority, civil rule and government. The legislature and the court was indefinitely kind of suspended. Martial law was declared, and we see a series of military governors. Now, people ask, why is the first gentleman, Walter Short, his tenure so short, or no pun intended, or so brief? Well, clearly he was removed because of dereliction in duty, because he failed to anticipate the Pearl Harbor attack. People always ask me, they're like, why was his tenure so short? I said, well, when you have an attack on your major military facilities, that is cause or grounds for termination. Respectfully, we say that. Okay. Now, of course, with the arrival of the military government, we are going to see literally tens of thousands of military personnel arriving to Hawaii shores. And where is this? Downtown. So we see, of course, we are in the perfect vicinity for this kind of historical presentation. You can do a historical tour, literally go downtown, and you could see essentially the same storefronts, businesses, residences, in which essentially these new arrivals first saw Hawaii. Okay? They arrived essentially to Honolulu Harbor. We see them essentially visiting downtown, not just, of course, military personnel, but, of course, war workers, essentially supplies coming to rebuild Oahu. Okay? Now imagine an exponential increase in the population numbers. So in some islands, in fact, we actually see the military outnumbering civilian or local populations. It was such a great disparity. So already, essentially, by June, we see over 250,000 military personnel, as well as defense workers. So for the very first time, locals actually witness Caucasians or whites doing the same kind of manual labor that they themselves had experienced on the plantations. It was very kind of eye-awakening to see essentially not just, of course, military personnel and their particular jobs and occupations, but also, of course, the support personnel. These are war workers, these are laborers, these are essentially people who were brought to the islands to help rebuild our military and civilian facilities that were destroyed by the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay. We also see, of course, the arrival of new populations that, again, will transform racial kind of dynamics here. So during my ethnic studies class, we talk about the plantation hierarchy. We talk about how essentially at the very top, divided by race, as well as, of course, by economic strata, we see essentially whites being Americans and British and sometimes Scottish plantation owners. Then we see, of course, the Lunas being Portuguese or Hawaiians. Then we, of course, see the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and Filipinos. So where do African Americans fall in? So these new arrivals really kind of change and transform and really kind of challenge racial perceptions. And in fact, upon their initial arrival, African Americans were mischaracterized as whites. People were like, what are you talking about? They said, well, they weren't Hawaiian, they weren't Asian, and they weren't white. Or were they? But maybe. So they got mischaracterized, at least in early kind of reports, as white military personnel, which is kind of interesting to kind of think about. Okay. Now we also see, of course, immediately the few hours following the Pearl Harbor attack, our local residents and families being incarcerated. Literally, of course, we see military officials, police arriving at doors, residents, businesses, schools, and essentially incarcerating our family members for sometimes in the case of the entire duration of war. I also like to talk to the families of these incarcerated individuals, and I always encourage people, I said, if you haven't done so, please contact the National Archives and Records Administration, particularly at College Park, Maryland, because they have a treasure trove of essentially incarceration materials. The military governor, the FBI, all kept very detailed records of inmates, and you will see many times they often photographed them, collected their personal belongings, letters. Sometimes, of course, they often investigated these individuals beforehand, and they fingerprinted them and they photographed them like criminals. And I'd like to kind of show this photo here. He's one of the individuals that I talked about or wrote about in my book. This is Minosuke Hanabusa. Who is that? So the grandfather of our former representative, Colleen Hanabusa, the family had a business right outside of Waianae. And the father was perceived as a threat. I don't know, you can't see this very clearly, but at 5 feet and 1.5 inches. He was deemed a military threat to the security and safety of our nation, and he was incarcerated for the duration of the war. So I just wanted to kind of highlight kind of the unique information that can actually be provided, that, you know, these men were not who you think of to be as perceived as a military threat, but as you can tell, this gentleman clearly was. Okay. Now, many of them were, of course, taken to various incarceration sites. For those residents here on Oahu, they would be taken to essentially various places and eventually transferred sometimes to mainland incarceration centers and, of course, also to Honouliuli. Across the islands, we have identified at least 17 different incarceration sites throughout the various islands. And of course, we do see very unique experiences that characterize each of these kinds of experiences. So in talking to people and their families and experiences, really delve into their stories. Where were you living? What were you doing? How was your grandfather, great-grandfather actually arrested? Often, of course, we see local officials like the police department actually coming and accompanying these FBI individuals with them because they knew exactly where they would actually be. Okay. So what we also like to see here is a very kind of unique understanding of the different types of incarceration centers. So what we see here, a very kind of different kind of incarceration experience from the mainland incarceration experience, not just for the numbers. But on the mainland, we see about 120,000 individuals being incarcerated to various sites. And we see kind of a unique kind of diversity in the governance of these sites. People who ran these various relocation centers, but also, of course, we see the Department of the Bureau of Justice or Bureau of Prisons, U.S. Army incarceration or internment camps. We see the War Relocation Authority. So we see kind of various competing individuals who had jurisdiction over these individuals. In Hawaii, we actually see kind of this broadly characterized as under military control. So most of them were Army internment camps, but we also see kind of a very unique feature where military officials, because they were so ill prepared for incarcerating the number of people, especially on the neighbor islands, would also utilize community and plantation structures. So we see jails, gymnasiums, language schools actually be utilized for that particular purpose. Okay. So here in Oahu, we see, of course, many of them taken to the immigration station down on Nimitz. We also see kind of the emergence of very hastily constructed Army facilities with Sand Island Detention Camp. Okay. And we later see kind of the formalized building of Honouliuli in 1943. Okay. And again, what's kind of very wonderful about the U.S. Army, or maybe less so, is that they kept kind of very nice photographic records of what these camps actually look like. So what you see here is that the enlisted men had sometimes tents, very kind of simple kind of structures that they were in fact housed in. The officers actually had kind of more formalized facilities, formal beds. So you see kind of disparity in accommodations depending upon your rank as a prisoner of war. Which is also interesting about Honouliuli is that its primary purpose that it served was as a POW camp, less so as an incarceration site. But we are going to see about 400 to 800 individuals go in and out of these incarceration centers locally. Now, I also, of course, like to kind of capture the unique kinds of experiences. And again, this was totally coincidental. But you can see downstairs the further drawings and kind of depictions of some of these incarceration sites as immortalized by a very famous Hawaii Island resident, George Hoshida, who was a very talented artist. And he drew essentially many of these camps and his experiences, not just in Hawaii, but as he traveled to the various incarceration centers. You actually see kind of a very interesting progression of his experiences. So Kilauea Military Camp, that many Hawaii children visit as part of their, usually it's around 5th or 6th grade. They go to Hawaii Island, they see Kilauea, they see essentially Volcanoes National Park. They don't realize that they're also staying, oftentimes, in an incarceration center that has been essentially transformed to a more kind of R&R, rest and relaxation kind of facility for local as well as mainland and military families. If you go to other neighbor islands, Kanakakai, for example, in Molokai, you will see a different kind of incarceration center or incarceration site. Now, I was told that this photo is actually a little bit outdated. Someone just went last year and they said one of the structures has completely collapsed. So this is Malama Park, which actually serves primarily to stage and house canoes for the local canoe clubs there. But at the very corner of Kanakakai Park, you will actually see essentially these jails that were used to incarcerate local residents. So at least 5 different individuals were incarcerated on Molokai in these sites before transferring to Oahu and then transferring to mainland incarceration centers. Okay. For our friends and family from Kauai here, we do see Kauai residents being taken to the former courthouse and jail, not the current one. This was essentially a photograph of it before its demolition. You will see essentially the jail, the little small building to, I guess, your right. These were the kinds of facilities that were used to interrogate and incarcerate these individuals. Okay. Also, of course, this was the old jail on the site of the new jail, but it was known for its lack of ventilation, its humidity, its swamp-like conditions in the surrounding areas. So many residents actually complained about the mosquito bites, the bed bites that were just rampant throughout these particular facilities here. Something that you don't hear about. So you hear kind of very different kind of accommodations and experiences. Kauai prisoners particularly reported, especially during the summertime, it was incredibly humid. We had bed bugs, we had fleas, we had essentially flies and mosquitoes just eating us to death at night. It was just incredibly terrible. Okay. A very interesting site is an island that many people do not visit unless you have a certain income level, evidently. This is Lanai, one of my favorite islands to visit, because you really kind of see 2 different sides of the island. You see one being kind of the resort and the luxury resort kind of accommodations with the 4 seasons and, the lodge and all of these incredible facilities. But if you go into town, you'll go to Dole Park, which is a rectangular shaped park, and you'll see pretty much the entire town built around that one particular park. Of course, Dole, the primary industry is, of course, plantation and pineapple production. So you'll see, various shops. You will see the most expensive supermarket you will probably ever visit in your entire life. And I'm not talking about Whole Foods. It's incredible how much things are on these smaller neighbor islands. It's incredible. I still remember going to Molokai and paying $35 for pizza. I said, it was incredible. I was like, $35? I said, is there something special? And the locals didn't blink. They said, yep, that's the price of pizza. Okay. But if you go to the corner of Dole Park, you will see this, which in part has been turned into a semi-tourist attraction. It's open to the public. There's no signage. It just says that it is a historic Lanai jail. And you can go visit, open it up, and see and experience the incarceration that Lanai residents actually experience. It's open to the public. There's no restrictions. In fact, you can see there's a sign. You can just open it up. You can walk in and visit and experience what it means to be incarcerated on Lanai, which most people do not understand what this jail actually, its purpose that it served, or what it actually represented, especially during World War II. So it's kind of this disparity in how we honor and remember certain incarceration sites. We let others fall into decay and disrepair, and we turn others into entertainment or tourist attractions, which is kind of terrifying when you really kind of think about. And this is where I do encourage people to learn more about the incarceration experience. We always have people, of course, following my presentations argue for signage, and I absolutely agree about that, for preservation. All of this, unfortunately, takes a lot of money, a lot of effort. The locals, of course, do recognize that these serve as important historical sites. It's a matter of actually getting the resources, the money, the funding, the preservation, the archaeological kind of services that need to be done around these sites to preserve them properly. Okay, and of course, I focus on my book kind of two kind of very distinct and also very different fates that essentially we see in many Hawaii families. So while my book does focus on essentially the incarceration story and how many families and communities suffered and still do continue to suffer because of the World War II experience, this is also in contrast with what has been for many years the dominant historical narrative of the Japanese American experience as celebrated by the military exploits of the 442, MIS, 100th Infantry Battalion, and other celebrated military regiments that were predominantly Japanese in character. So I really kind of encourage people to recognize the very unique kind of disparate or different fates that our communities experience. And I'm going to share this from my own kind of personal side here, that in my family, we saw two very different experiences of war. So on my father's side, we had members that served on the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442. My grandfather was enlisted in the Army. He never actually engaged in military service, but he actually did and developed a trade through his military service, and he's buried up with my uncles and my grandfather and my extended family out on Punch Bowl. And on the other side, we have my grandmother's side, who was based in Japan. And my grandmother's, so that's my father's mother's side, was from Hiroshima, Japan. And so our family kind of had a very different kind of experience of the war on that side. So my grandmother actually technically is characterized as a kibe, which is a person who was born, she was actually born on Young Street. She was born in Hawaii, and then the family moved back to Japan. And she actually went back and forth between two different families. They had something going on with a cousin. They wanted to share my grandmother. But my grandmother also had a sister. And during the war, her sister evidently met and married a Japanese soldier. So 1941, 1942. They got married. Clearly, they had a wedding night. He left to the jungles of Southeast Asia, never to be seen ever again. And 9 months later, a child would be born, a daughter who would never see her father. Okay. After the war, during her 30s, late 30s, early 40s, my grandmother's sister died actually prematurely early. We don't exactly know why. We don't know if it was because of the radiation. We don't know what health issues she might have experienced or suffered. So here was this orphan child, this daughter of this union from the war. And so what happened after the war is that my grandmother would have two sons, my father and my uncle, but she always wanted a daughter. So she would adopt her sister's child as her own. And so in my family, we understood it as, this is a child, a motherless and fatherless child. and my grandmother was a daughterless mother. So my grandmother kind of de facto adopted her niece as her daughter. And throughout my entire life, this cousin technically was referred to as an aunt, that she was essentially part of the family. She was my father's sister. I thought, oh, that's interesting. But that's not grandpa's daughter. No, it's from a different side. But that's a relative? Yes. So in my family, we had both sides. We had those experience the trauma and hardship of war, and we also had those who benefited and celebrated and reaped rewards from the war itself. Again, my grandfather was born on a plantation in Kauai. I share to my students, many of them who are first-generation college students, I am technically only 2 generations removed from the plantations. My grandfather had a 6th grade education along with my grandmother. But because of their experiences from the plantations, as well as during the war, they strongly emphasized education. And that is where my father was actually the first generation to go to college, first generation actually to even graduate from high school. And he said to us, he says, do you know how hard it is to go to high school and later college, and your parents cannot even speak English? They cannot even help you. They're so embarrassed to speak to their teachers because their English is so poor. And then going on to college and trying to explain what you're doing and why you need to study as you're working during the summer with the plantations, with essentially the cannery, working the Janako machine. We hear all those stories too. It says, to understand that and how far our generations have come, we really need to cohesively and collectively understand the experiences of all of our families here in Hawaii. So on that bright note, that is my presentation for today. Okay, question. So right now, I believe, Brianna, question and answer session? Yes.
If you're on Zoom and have any questions, please use the Q&A function and I'll read them out to Dr. Nakamura. We're going to mic run to anyone who has questions just so our online audience can hear as well.
Thank you, Kelly. That was a great presentation.
Thank you,
I
Sharon.
wanted to hear more about, you talked about the disparity of experiences between those who fought for the United States in the military. I'm wondering, so for those that were taken away and incarcerated, for their families, how were they treated by others in the community or the non-Japanese, and how were they treated when they came back?
Well, this is a great story that we can, you do actually have audience members that can actually kind of address that personally. We hear stories about how they were shunned, how no one wanted to be in contact with them because they themselves similarly feared being incarcerated without just cause. I'd like to share this story of the Mori family, a very prominent family, one of the founding families of Kuakini Hospital, formerly known as the Japanese Hospital. So we do have, in fact, multiple members of the Mori family who were in fact incarcerated during the war. So these were prominent physicians, these were prominent individuals in the pre-war Japanese community. They were incarcerated, both the father as well as the mother, for the entire duration of the war. And when they returned, they said, our lives were never the same. Yes, we were still physicians, but we never regained the status and respect that was in fact afforded to us. But I encourage people to learn more about what would happen to their children. So we do have actual oral accounts from their son who said, during the war, I had a good time. And this was a Japanese American male. He says, I went to Puno school, so you can tell how very different economic status they were. And he said, I just went crazy, was without parental supervision, was, without any parental controls. And he said, I just did everything bad. I just did everything naughty. I just was just totally free. And that wasn't good for what I did. And he says, my sister though, he felt actually held it in. And he said, she was very quiet. She never really shared what she had experienced being without her mother and father for all of those years. And later, in fact, she would commit suicide. And he would, in fact, attribute that to some of the experiences that she had endured in part during the war. She said, my sister was a very sensitive individual. And even if my parents returned, even if they were still physicians and they were still respected, you still see kind of generational impacts of this experience even later. So thank you for asking that great question. We have another.
Thank you for your presentation. I read an American Girl book about this time period and learned different things about martial law that I hadn't known. One of them I remember was that the curfew hours were different for Japanese residents than they were for other locals. So I'm wondering if you can talk more about what martial law looked like on the island in people's everyday life.
So martial law was instituted on December 7th. We're going to be seeing essentially not just, of course, curfews, but my grandmother still remembers having blackouts. She said if you didn't have blackout curtains, you then painted your windows. You would also see essentially food and rationing and regulations on gasoline. So I like to say, our Hawaii practice that a lot of mainlanders make fun of us stockpiling canned goods, toilet paper, rice, and all of that. I said, not only just because of natural disasters, but because, of course, the rationing that occurred during the war. We do see essentially school children experiencing, at least at this time, air raid drills. I was actually going to show a photograph of McKinley High School, how in the front lawn they actually have essentially trenches that were dug in case of an aerial attack of the Japanese, and that's what they made the children actually do. Not just, of course, contribute and dig the ditches, but also, of course, also practice air raid drills. Many students also remembered having to carry gas masks with them. They had essentially these military salvage drives of rubber, rationing, of essentially patriotism, supporting the war effort by buying war bonds. So we see a lot of kind of community mobilization that I think not just reflects just patriotism, but also kind of wartime fears about what in fact is actually happening or transpiring. So great question. Susan.
Aloha, Dr. Nakamura. My mother-in-law was one of those little Japanese girls in Mo'iliili during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Her parents destroyed her Japanese emperor dolls, which, she regretted until she died, sent her to Marino school. She converted from Buddhism to Catholicism. What kind of general changes were there in Hawaii from Japanese cultural ways after World War II? I mean, I realize it's a big topic, and of course it probably varies by family, but her family made an extreme turn to show that they were good American citizens. And what kind of what happened?
So that is a great question about the transformation of Japanese communities and Japanese families following the war. There was what we refer to as house cleaning. People stripped their homes of any kind of evidence of a Japanese affiliation, pictures of the emperor, letters, correspondence, any kind of essentially Japanese-looking items such as dolls, clothing. Many of them destroyed them. Some of them hid them. One of my favorite kind of stories that come out of Lanai is that there's a honganji there, and right after the Pearl Harbor attack, the bell disappeared in the temple. Their bell disappeared. No one knew what happened to it. No one knew where it went. Disappeared for the entire duration of the war because it would be taken over, that building, by the military in Lanai. And then following the conclusion of the war, the bell miraculously appeared. No one knows where it appeared, just showed up one day. And there it is again. No questions asked, no concern, but that's how it was. We see essentially in some generations this effort to Americanize by something as simple or as straightforward as renaming ourselves. So my grandfather, we don't even know what he was called before. He was an Issei, became Harry. His sons became Walter and Sonny. My grandmother, the Kibe, who went back and forth, tried to show how American she was by naming her two sons after Yankee baseball players. But they weren't famous, evidently, and they were names that she could not even pronounce. So my father's name is Wesley. L is terrible. And my uncle is Vernon, right? So to prove how American she was and how acculturated and assimilated, she named her children names that she couldn't even pronounce. But you see, of course, my grandmother was Betty, and then we had Doris in our family. We had, just a shift in essentially naming and the speaking of Japanese language. The third and fourth generation, we just lament the fact that we don't speak Japanese, or we don't speak Japanese very well. It's really quite sad. I mean, we hear Japanese words and we can understand it. But myself being fourth generation, good God, my daughter being fifth, our Japanese language skills, our cultural understanding is very limited, So that kind of fluency and that kind of familiarity, Japanese language presses, language schools were all closed at that time. So we had essentially a censorship of Japanese news and information, really kind of transformed environments. So we see, for example, Japanese enclaves like Makali, Mo'iliili, Kalihi, Manoa, really kind of shifting their kind of identities. It was speak American, no Japanese. And so we also like to say that the Issei, or the first generation, became a very silent generation. They couldn't communicate, they couldn't speak, for fear that their Japanese language would be used as an indication of their alleged allegiance to the Japanese emperor and be cause for incarceration.
Somebody else? No. Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, my question was, of the Japanese Americans living in Hawaii at the time, what percentage of them were actually incarcerated? And generically, why were those incarcerated versus others?
So that is a great question about the numbers. So in the pre-war period, just to kind of give context, the Japanese population would number about 40% of the population. We were that large of a number. And depending upon the time period of when essentially, how many numbers, 8 to 10%, depending upon people were released, incarcerated, the number fluctuates. So we also hear stories about people immediately being incarcerated, and then a year later being incarcerated, people being released, people then being rearrested. So the numbers would fluctuate throughout the entire duration of the war, but it truly was a minority compared to the 100% of the 120,000 of the mainland incarcerated individuals.
We have one question from online that I'd like to ask you as well, and then I think we can take one more from the audience. So someone has asked, you spoke of the greater co-prosperity sphere where Japan was doing what the Western world had done with colonialism and claiming territories, and this individual just asks, what is your take on this view of history where the Western world resented what Japan was doing, which was copying Western colonialism?
Exactly. I mean, that is a great point to highlight about kind of the hypocrisy of Western imperial nations, particularly in the Pacific. America had a long-standing history of imperialistic activities throughout the Pacific, as well as Great Britain, France, and Germany, as well as Russia. And it's so ironic, the hypocrisy of criticizing an Asian nation for doing exactly the same thing that essentially they themselves were doing. So this idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Asia for Asians, the Japanese would posit themselves as so modern, so Western, that they had adopted the Western ideas of racial superiority. And so for the Japanese, this oil embargo in the 1930s was a provocation for war. They had no choice. The Americans, again, looking at kind of the disparate kind of understandings of the Pearl Harbor attack, would see this as an, unjust, just heathen act, of course, because it was a Sunday, of this pagan nation on essentially American military might at this particular time. So I appreciate that comment about kind of highlighting the hypocrisy of this time. And you will actually see throughout even just the World War II experience, kind of these disparate treatments or understandings that would characterize many kind of events during this time period. I think we had one more question here.
Yeah, could you briefly explain what was the basis of different reasons for being put on the arrest list, the essays?
So we do know in the pre-1941 period, there was all of these lists that were running around compiled by the FBI, by the Honolulu police, by essentially civil and military officials. So there was A1 and A1A and 1B. And if you occupied a high position or status in the Japanese community, so if you're a business owner, if you're a newspaper editor, if you were a Buddhist priest, a Shinto priest, anything that kind of would highlight your allegiance to the Japanese nation, if you were a consulate representative. So for example, throughout the various islands, we also had consular representatives. These were individuals who helped communicate with people who were illiterate and could actually write letters on behalf of their fellow countrymen to submit to the consulate, to the Japanese government. If you also, of course, had visited even the Japanese Navy, who would regularly arrive in the islands to Honolulu Harbor, if you welcomed these military officers to your homes and invited them as part of your service to essentially the Japanese country, that was also grounds for being suspect and being put on this list. But you also hear people wondering, saying, why was I put on this list, or why wasn't I put on this list? So we also see, of course, some plantation laborers being put on this list. I also wrote about this wonderful family, this wonderful individual, Mitsumio Totori. He was one of the few Buddhist priests. He was from the Shingon Mission sect, who was allowed not just to remain in Hawaii, but to continue to practice and minister in Hawaii, which is kind of interesting. So while many Shinto Buddhist sects and temples were shut down, he was out in Haleiwa and ministering and preaching. And what is really unique about that particular story is that what he actually did, and this is why he remains in many of the historical books, is that he wrote out ihai, or memorial tablets, for those individuals, those servicemen who died in combat, who were killed in action, who went missing. And he did prayer or memorial services for them. So the University of Hawaii at Manoa archives actually have these memorial tablets of these individuals that he memorialized and practiced during the duration of the war. And what's kind of even more interesting about him is that because, as I mentioned, there were gas rations at that particular time, knowing that he would actually minister to various individuals and families during this particular period, the plantation would actually allocate him additional gasoline rations. So everyone knew what was going on. It was this weird kind of disparity and discrepancy about kind of their experiences. So, this priest is running around and he's ministering, and we're going to give him extra gas to help him accomplish his goals. So you'll see kind of, again, these unique stories that emerge, as we like to say, only in Hawaii. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kelly. If we can please give her a round of applause.